Hello and welcome to my channel, Christina's Cleaning and Homemaking. If you are new here, welcome. If you haven't subscribed yet, please click the subscribe button down below. And if you click on the little bell, YouTube will notify you when I have new videos up. And if you're already a subscriber or you've been here before, welcome back. Always glad to have you. In this video, I'm going to be making a birthday cake for my daughter. There's nothing like having a homemade cake for holidays and celebrations, particularly birthdays. And so today is my daughter's second birthday. It's the 4th of July. And so I'm making her a 4th of July themed birthday cake. So I'll show you how to make the cake and I'll link the recipe down below for that. And I'll also show you how to frost the cake, which I don't use a solid recipe for that, but I sort of wing it, but I'll show you that it's not that hard to do. And come along with me to make a cake. So to start, you're gonna need a stick of butter, which has been softened. So I stick mine in the microwave for about 15 seconds if it isn't completely softened and sort of thawed out by the time I need it for the recipe. And I'll mash that up just a little bit just to try and get it broken down before adding the sugar to the recipe. Now it's time to add the sugar, and I like to use the Florida Organic crystals whenever I cook, and bread and muffins and cakes, pretty much whatever I use sugar in. And so I'm measuring out the first cup of sugar here and just shaking it down a little bit. And I try and get it as even as possible on top. And so I'll just dump that in. And now for the half cup, since I have the first cup measured out. Point, I'll pull out the hand mixer, plug that in, and put the mixing pieces on it, just for making a cake. I don't use the same ones that I use for making bread, but these are the ones that I use for making muffins. So I'll put that in on the lowest speed and start mixing the butter and the sugar in order to cream the butter. That's what this process is called, is creaming it. And even though the butter was softened, the sugar and butter still seem to clump up more, not get real smooth. So as you'll see in a moment, when I start adding the eggs in, that's when the mixture starts getting really smooth and creamy. Now it's time for the eggs, and the eggs I'm using are duck eggs that I get from a local couple here who has a bunch of chickens and ducks, and so we buy our eggs from them. And so for the cake I used duck eggs, and so that was the first egg, and then you'll see the second egg here shortly, because the recipe calls for a total of 3 eggs. So I used 3 duck eggs in this recipe, but the recipe calls for 3 eggs in general, and it doesn't say size, whether they need to be medium large, extra large, or whatnot, so I just used duck eggs. Now that I have all the wet ingredients mixed together, it's time for the dry ingredients. So I'm starting out with the flour, and I just used the multi-purpose baking flour. And it calls for 2 cups of flour, so I scoop that out, shake it out roughly to level it, and then put it in. And then it also calls for baking soda, and it called for 3 teaspoons of that, and then a half teaspoon. So as you can see here, I measured the baking powder out and got that in there, and then I'm adding the salt, and I use a salt grinder, so I'm sort of ballparking how much I need to put in, but from making the muffins I kind of have an idea of what constitutes 1 teaspoon of salt. So I'm mixing that all together, and then once I get it mixed together, it's going to start going into the butter and sugar and eggs mixture, and we'll start really getting going on putting this batter together. So for this recipe, it wanted me to have the butter, sugar, and eggs all mixed together well, and then add in some of the flour, and then it has me add in milk. And you're gonna put in a total of 2 cups of milk, but you're gonna go back and forth between the flour mixture and the milk. So you'll put in some milk so it doesn't seem so stiff and dry, and then as it gets a little bit soggier, you'll put in more of the flour, and you'll see the batter start to come together and look like cake batter. Now that we've got all that mixed together, it's time for the teaspoon of the vanilla. And I use the pure vanilla extract as opposed to the imitation because I like it better and I think it tastes better, and it's not really that expensive to use. Now that everything is getting mixed together, it's time to preheat the oven, which I could have done at the beginning, but I haven't really found need to do that because with greasing the cake pans and getting the batter into the cake pans, that usually takes up the extra time, so that way the oven isn't on extra long on the 4th of July when it was really hot out, and therefore making the kitchen extra hot. So I basically take about a tablespoon of butter, and I rub it down on all the surfaces that I think the cake batter will touch on the pans. And I used 2 smaller square pans instead of 1 long pan because I want to make this a stacked cake. So I made sure to get all the sides, corners, crevices, the bottom, everything, and then I'm sprinkling flour in it. So I'm doing the whole butter and flour method instead of just butter method. And so I'm shaking it around trying to get it to mix, and the flour really didn't want to move that much, so after shaking it around some, I used my hands to spread the flour out more evenly, and then it didn't give me so much of a problem of moving around and getting on the sides and any surface that it hadn't covered yet. And I dumped off any of the extra flour from the one dish into the other one, so that way I could get extra flour out of there and mix it around in the second dish more. And then once I got that dish sufficiently covered, I actually pulled the bowl over that I used to mix the flour in to begin with, and I shook off any extra flour from that dish into the bowl, so that way it didn't have any excess flour in it, and then try to get out any from the first cake dish as well. And now I'm putting the batter into the 2 cake pans. I try to get it as evenly as possible, but one cake did end up coming out slightly bigger than the other, but it's not that big of a deal. Now into the oven for 40 minutes. The recipe calls for 40 to 45 minutes, but I noticed that my oven seems to bake quickly, so I went for the 40-minute countdown, and then I checked it once it hit the 40 minutes with a toothpick in the center, and when I tested it both times, the toothpick came out completely clean, so the cake was done in only 40 minutes as opposed to 45 minutes. So at this point, I take the cakes out of the oven and I put them on the stove to cool a little bit, and I turn the oven off. Now I let the cake sit on the stove for probably about 5 to 10 minutes to cool before I try and use the spatula to make sure that the sides are all loose so I can get the cake out easy, because I didn't want to do it when they were still really hot. And I used oven mitts to shake them around too. I learned this in cake decorating class in high school, of going around the edges with a spatula and then shaking the cake free to make sure that it was completely loose and came out. And it really didn't give me any problems coming out of the pan. It came out quite nicely. One of the reasons why I try and let the cake cool a little bit before transferring it on the plate is to avoid the cake sticking too much to the plate, because I'm going to put it top side down. I could grab another plate and shift it back to top side up, but it didn't seem really absolutely necessary, and I only lost a little bit of that top layer of the cake to the plates from the moisture and heat from the cake cooling, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But that is an option where you could actually put another plate on top and flip it back over to the back side. But while it's still warm, it's probably going to at least stick to the plate a little bit. And now onto the frosting. So I'm unwrapping the sticks of butter. They've been sitting out while the cake was cooking, so they got nice and soft so that they'll be easier to mix and break down and incorporate into the powdered sugar. And I used 3 sticks of butter initially. I ran out of icing towards the end, so I ended up using another stick and a half roughly in order to finish off decorating the cake. But I'm getting the mixer ready here, and then I'm going to start pouring in the powdered sugar. And like I said before, I kind of ballpark how much powdered sugar I use. So I started out scooping out probably in half cup increments, but I did that 3 times. That equals roughly like what, a cup and a half. So I started out with that, and basically as I'm mixing the frosting, it's butter and it's powdered sugar, and then as it sort of gets kind of to a crumbly consistency, I put in milk, and that helps smooth it out. So basically it's going back and forth, adding powdered sugar to it until the butter taste isn't as strong. You taste more of like the sweet taste, and that's how you know that the frosting is done. So I'm just mixing it up with the hand mixer here in order to get it all incorporated, and there's adding a little bit of the milk in order to get it to soften up and thin out. So it's coming along here quite nicely, and then soon I'll be getting to the texture that'll make it appropriate for icing the cake, and I'll put the initial layer on, which is pretty much just white, so I don't have to color that at all. At this point, I take a sample of the frosting because I want to make sure it's at the right consistency before I start frosting the cake, and it was, and I even gave my husband a sample, and we both agreed the frosting was ready to go. So I used a knife instead of like a Wilton spreader, which you can use them too, but I didn't happen to buy one, so I just went with the knife that I had. And the butter knife actually works, pretty well, so it's not that big of a deal. But I iced the entire first layer with the frosting there, and I tried to make sure to get the sides pretty covered as best I could because it is slightly angled, but I got all the top layer done, and then I went for the sides, making sure to try and get them covered. Now once I got everything iced, I used Smucker's strawberry jam in the squeeze bottle to put on as the in-between layer. And this is something I picked up from my wedding cake years ago, that I could pick two flavors. So I picked vanilla and I picked strawberry. And she put strawberry in the middle of the layers of the wedding cake, and it was so good. So since this is a 4th of July red, white, and blue themed cake, I decided to get the strawberry jam and stick it between the layers. And let me tell you, it was fantastic. My husband absolutely loved the cake. My daughter loved the cake. It turned out really delicious, and having that layer in there really added to it. So now time to add the second layer and then frost that, and then once we get that covered, then it'll be time to decorate it. And for the colors for the frosting, I used the Wilton cake colors. I used the Tasteless Red, I used blue, and then to write Happy Birthday on the top of it, I used a rose pink, and it came out almost like a hot pink, really. And then for the frosting tips that I used the star tips for the blue section. I used a flat tip to make the red stripes, and then I used the small round tip to write the wording, which you'll see here in a moment. And I used the couplers to secure the tips to the bags, and I could have used regular frosting bags, but I decided against it, and I actually used a combination of the smaller sandwich bags by Ziploc and the larger gallon bags in order to do the frosting. I just clipped a corner of the bag off, and that worked really well because most of my frosting bags I use for soap, and I really didn't want to dig into them to do this. And I know from past experience of having made cakes before that using a Ziploc bag with the corner cut off works really well. So now that I have the cake frosted, it's time to add the color decoration I was talking about before. So I'm going to start with the red to make the stripes on the cake to give me a basis for knowing where to put the blue part of the flag. So now that I have the red and the blue part on, I've been taking the extra frosting that I had and just sort of making a stripe around the side of the cake, and then when I got to the blue part, since that had the star tip on it, I made it a little bit more of a flower kind of design, trimming the cake, which turned out really nice. So basically around half side of the cake there's a red sort of thin stripe, and then on the other half of the cake there's a nice flowery blue design. Since it was my daughter's second birthday, I decided to put 2 white stars on there instead of trying to squeeze in a bunch of stars. So that's why there's 2 stars on there. Now it's just time to add the Happy Birthday Gabriella, and the cake is done. So now the cake is done, and I have a delicious and wonderful 4th of July themed cake ready for my daughter for her birthday, and we're gonna sure enjoy digging into it once we get all the barbecuing and cooking for dinner done. And I hope you liked this video. If you did, please click like down below, and if you haven't yet, please click subscribe, and I will see you in my next video.